Picture this: a funeral, somewhere in Middle America, a gray Tuesday afternoon. The kind of day that feels like the sky itself is grieving. Low clouds, cold wind, the smell of rain coming. The church is full, colleagues in dark suits, neighbors with red eyes, a wife in black, clutching a handkerchief, accepting condolences from people filing past her in a slow, solemn line. Children sitting stiff and confused in the front pew, too young to fully understand what is happening, old enough to know something is terribly wrong. Flowers, a closed casket, a photograph on a stand, a smiling man in a family portrait. The kind of photo where everyone is slightly too posed and slightly too happy. The kind of photo that only gets printed and framed after something goes wrong. The pastor speaks. The man was a good husband, a devoted father, a pillar of the community. He will be missed. People weep. People hug. People say the things people say at funerals. He's in a better place. He wouldn't want us to be sad. He's watching over us now. And somewhere, in a motel room 3 states away, or on a beach in a country with no extradition treaty, or in a rented apartment under a new name, the man in the photograph is very much alive. He is watching the clock, calculating, waiting. He has pulled off the most audacious disappearing act in modern history. He has faked his own death. He has vanished with money that wasn't his. He has left behind a wife who may or may not have known, children who will spend years wondering what really happened to their father, creditors who will never see their money, and investigators who will spend years, sometimes decades, hunting a ghost. This is not one story. It is many stories. Because faking your own death, the crime that sounds like fiction, the escape that sounds like a movie plot, is more common than you think, more sophisticated than you imagine, and more devastating to the people left behind than any crime thriller ever captures. Tonight, we go deep into the world of pseudocide, the act of faking your own death. We will meet the men who did it. We will follow the money. We will follow the lies. We will trace the new identities, the new countries, the new lives built on a rubble of old ones. And we will ask the question that haunts every single one of these cases. Can you ever truly escape who you are? Stay with me. This one will keep you up at night. Before we get into the specific cases, and we will in graphic, breathtaking detail, we need to understand something fundamental. Why? Why would a person fake their own death? The answer seems obvious. To escape. But escape from what? That is where it gets interesting. The most common reason, so common it accounts for the majority of pseudocide cases, is money. Specifically, the absence of it. A man has built his life on a financial house of cards. Debts piled on debts. Investments gone wrong. Fraud committed and now closing in. Bankruptcy looming. Criminal charges imminent. The walls are closing in, and the only door that seems to lead anywhere is the one marked: cease to exist. If you are dead, you cannot be prosecuted. If you are dead, your debts die with you. If you are dead, the insurance company pays out sometimes millions to the family you left behind, which is actually a family you secretly relocated to a beach house in a country where the local police have never heard of you. This is a financial escape, and it is elegant in its cold logic. But money is not the only reason. Some people fake their deaths to escape relationships, a marriage that has become a prison, a controlling partner, a family situation so suffocating that disappearing feels like the only breath of air available. These cases are more complicated morally, because the victim is not an insurance company or a bank, but a person who genuinely loved a vanisher and is left behind in a kind of permanent, unresolvable grief. Some people fake their deaths to escape legal consequences. Criminal charges, outstanding warrants, sexual abuse allegations. These are the cases where the moral calculus is simplest. A person committed something terrible and chose cowardice over accountability. Some people, and these are the most psychologically fascinating, fake their deaths because they genuinely want to start over, not to steal money, not to escape charges, but because the life they were living felt so wrong, so trapped, so misaligned with who they believed themselves to be, that they couldn't see any other way out. These are the vanishers who are running towards something, not away from it, and their stories are the strangest of all. But here is what all these cases have in common. They all require an extraordinary thing: the willingness to look at the people you love, your wife, your children, your parents, your friends, and decide that your need to escape is more important than their need for truth. That is a level of selfishness or desperation, depending on how you look at it, that most of us cannot fully comprehend. And yet, people do it, more often than you think. Estimates suggest that in the United States alone, somewhere between 1 and 2,000 people successfully fake their deaths every year. Most are never caught. Most are never even investigated as fakes. Their deaths are accepted. Their insurance is paid. Their families mourn. And they live on, somewhere, somehow, under a different name, with a different face maybe, with a different story they tell strangers at bars in countries far from home. Let's begin with a case that shocked Britain and the world. John Darwin, former prison officer turned canoe enthusiast, a man with a pleasant, unremarkable face, the face of someone you wouldn't look twice at on a train, the kind of man whose neighbors would say, if asked, quiet, kept to himself, nice enough. John Darwin had a problem, several problems. Actually, all of them financial, all of them accumulated with the steady inevitability of a landslide. He had overstretched himself on property investments. He had debts that were growing faster than his ability to service them. His pension was modest. His prospects were not improving. And in the particular British way of suffering financial shame, quietly, internally, without telling anyone, letting the rot spread in secret, he said nothing to anyone, not even his wife, and then, on March 21st, 2002, John Darwin went out in his canoe on the North Sea near Hartlepool, England, and vanished. His canoe was found the next day, washed up on the shore, damaged, empty. His paddle was found separately. His body was never found. The conclusion was obvious. The sea had taken him. The North Sea in March is not forgiving. People drown. Bodies are not always recovered. It was a tragedy. It was awful. His wife was devastated. His 2 sons, Mark and Anthony, were destroyed. There was a memorial service. There was a death certificate issued. There was an inquest that returned an open verdict. Missing, presumed dead. And then the life insurance paid out. £100,000 from one policy, $250,000 from another, and Darwin used some of the money to pay off the debts. And then, with the rest, she did something that would only make sense years later, when the full truth emerged. She moved to Panama. Panama, a small Central American country with a warm climate, a pleasant lifestyle, remarkably discreet banking practices, and a general policy of not asking too many questions about where people came from or what they left behind. Here is the part of the story that makes your jaw drop. John Darwin was not dead. He had been living, in secret, in the house next door to the family home in Hartlepool. A connecting door had been quietly installed between 2 properties that and had purchased. John Darwin was moving between the houses, living a hidden domestic life, eating meals with his wife, sleeping under the same roof, almost as the woman who was publicly presenting herself as his widow for 5 years. 5 years, while his sons mourned, while investigators had closed the case, while and had quietly been cashing the insurance money. And then it got even stranger. John Darwin walked into a London police station in December 2007. He presented himself at the desk and said words that the duty officer probably thought he had misheard. "I think I am a missing person." He claimed, audaciously, almost insanely, that he had amnesia, that he couldn't remember the last 5 years, that he had somehow wandered into consciousness in London with no memory of being dead. Nobody believed this for a second. And then a newspaper found the photograph. A photograph taken in Panama in 2006. John Darwin, grinning, standing next to his wife Anne, both of them smiling for the camera in the offices of a property company where they had been looking at buying a house together. The house they were planning to share in their new Panamanian life after the money ran out and the coast was clear. The photograph destroyed everything. John Darwin pleaded guilty to fraud. He was sentenced to 6 years and 3 months in prison. And Darwin, who had maintained the fiction of being a grieving widow, who had even told her own sons that their father was dead, who had cried in front of television cameras, appealing for information about her missing husband while knowing exactly where he was sentenced to 6.5 years. The sons, Mark and Anthony, gave interviews that were heartbreaking in their controlled fury. Their father had allowed them to grieve for years while he was next door. They said they felt their entire childhoods, their entire sense of family, had been retroactively destroyed. The family has never fully reconciled. And John Darwin? He served less than half his sentence. He was released. He tried to rebuild some kind of life. He wrote a book. He did interviews. But some things you cannot come back from. Some things follow you even when you run. The Darwin case is remarkable for its intimacy, its strange domestic quality, the connecting door, the years of hiding next door. But it is relatively small in terms of the money involved. When we scale up, when we get to the financial fraudsters, the men who stole not hundreds of thousands but millions, sometimes tens of millions, sometimes more, the stories become more dramatic, more global, and in some cases more terrifying. Consider the archetype: a successful businessman, respected in his community, drives the right car, lives in the right neighborhood. His children go to the right schools. He gives to charities. He appears on local business awards lists. Underneath, the reality is different. He has been running a scheme, maybe a Ponzi scheme, promising investors extraordinary returns that he cannot actually deliver, paying early investors with money from new ones, riding the wave until the wave catches up with him. Maybe a simple embezzlement, stealing from his own company, from his clients, from his partners. Maybe a complex financial fraud involving multiple entities, shell companies, offshore accounts, transactions that require forensic accountant months to fully understand. The scheme runs for years, sometimes decades, and then, as these schemes always do, it begins to unravel. Maybe a client asks awkward questions. Maybe an auditor gets too close. Maybe a business partner starts to suspect. Maybe the SEC sends a letter. Maybe the FBI shows up at the office. At the moment the walls close in, the man has choices. He can confess, accept the consequences, face prosecution, lose everything. He can run, physically run, get on a plane, try to make it to a country without an extradition treaty before the authorities can stop him. Or he can die, not actually die, but create the appearance of death so convincing that the investigation loses its primary target. The insurance pays his family, and he buys himself time, hopefully enough time to establish a new identity and a new life somewhere beyond the reach of American or European law. This third option is more appealing than it sounds, because death, unlike flight, neutralizes a search. A fugitive is hunted. A dead man is mourned. The difference between those two conditions is the difference between every law enforcement resource being aimed at you and every law enforcement resource being redirected to more urgent living problems. The classic template involves several elements. First, establish financial cover. Get money out before you disappear. Move it to accounts that cannot be easily traced. Offshore, cryptocurrency, in more recent years, cash. Make sure that money is accessible to you, but invisible to investigators. Second, create the death event. This is the hardest part. It needs to be convincing, but it also needs to not produce a body, because a body can be identified, and an identified body is proof of death that actually works. So the ideal pseudocide death involves water, the sea, a river, a lake, water that can swallow a person without producing a recoverable body. Car accidents are sometimes used, but cars produce evidence, skid marks, point of impact, forensic data. Fire is used, but DNA survives fire in ways that are increasingly difficult to fake. Water is cleanest. Water is darkest. Water has been swallowing secrets since before there were humans to make them. Third, establish the new identity. This is where technology has both helped and hurt would-be vanishers. In the analog age, a convincing fake passport, a new name, some dyed hair and a beard, and you could build a new life with relative ease. The world was larger then. Its record-keeping was slower and more porous. People fell through the cracks all the time. In the digital age, facial recognition technology, international database sharing, social media footprints, and cell phone location tracking have made disappearing genuinely difficult in a way it wasn't 30 years ago. and yet people still try, and people still succeed. Fourth, and this is the part that most people underestimate, manage the loneliness. Because you are dead, you cannot call your mother, you cannot visit your children, you cannot attend your best friend's wedding or your father's funeral. You are locked in a permanent exile from every human connection you ever had. You are, in the most profound sense, alone. And loneliness, not investigators, not technology, not bad luck, is what ultimately catches most of them. Samuel Israel III. The name sounds like old money, like generations of it. And, in a way, it was. Sam Israel came from a family with a history in finance. He was raised in a world where money was understood, where markets were discussed at dinner tables, where the expectation of success in the financial world was built into him from childhood. He founded Bayou Group in 1996, a hedge fund. He told investors he was generating extraordinary returns, double digits, consistent, year after year, in markets where such consistency was extremely difficult. The returns were fake. Bayou Group was a fraud from nearly the beginning. Sam Israel was not generating the returns he claimed. He was falsifying account statements. He was lying to investors. And as the lies compounded, as the gap between what he claimed and what actually existed grew wider and harder to paper over, the pressure became unbearable. By 2005, the fraud had unraveled. Sam Israel pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit securities fraud and other charges. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison. He was supposed to report to prison on June 9, 2008. He did not report. Instead, his Winnebago was found on the Bear Mountain Bridge in New York, a bridge spanning the Hudson River, a bridge from which people have, tragically, jumped. The windows were down. The keys were in the ignition. And on the dusty hood of the Winnebago, someone had written 2 words in the grime. Suicide is painless. The reference was to the theme from the television show MASH. Law enforcement's initial assumption, Sam Israel had jumped. Divers searched the Hudson River. No body. Boats searched. Nothing. Search teams combed the riverbanks. No Samuel Israel. And then tips started coming in. A man matching Samuel Israel's description had been seen in Massachusetts, then in Maine, then reports from other states. Sam Israel had not jumped off the bridge. He had staged the scene, leaving his Winnebago with its theatrical message, banking on the assumption that investigators would conclude he had jumped and call off the search. He had instead been living as a fugitive. He had been moving around, staying with a girlfriend who later claimed she didn't fully understand the situation, operating under the radar. He lasted 47 days. Samuel Israel III turned himself in on July 2, 2008. He walked into a Massachusetts police station and surrendered. His sentence was increased. He is currently serving 22 years. The 47 days of freedom he bought with the bridge stunt cost him 2 additional years of prison time. Not a great trade by any measure. But here is what makes the Sam Israel story more than just a cautionary tale about hedge fund fraud. He was not a stupid man. He had run a complex financial fraud for nearly a decade. He had managed investor relationships, falsified sophisticated financial documents, constructed and maintained an elaborate deception. And yet, when it came to faking his own death, when it came to the actual execution of the escape, he wrote, "Suicide is painless" in the dust of a car and expected that to be sufficient. There is something almost poignant about the gap between the sophistication of his financial crimes and the crudeness of his escape attempt, as if the energy required to sustain a decade of fraud had simply run out, as if, at the moment when it mattered most, he had nothing left. Here is an uncomfortable truth. For every John Darwin who walks into a police station, for every Samuel Israel who lasts 47 days, for every amateur pseudocide that falls apart within months, there are others, people who are never caught, people who are never even suspected, people who built new lives so completely, so convincingly, so cleanly, that no one ever knew to look for them. We do not know their names. By definition, we cannot, because they succeeded. But from the cases that have been unraveled, from the postmortems of discovered suicides, from the testimonies of investigators who worked these cases, from the accounts of people who built new identities and eventually chose to come forward, we can construct a picture of what success in this dark art actually looks like. The first element is patience. The most successful suicides are not rushed. They are planned over years. The money is moved slowly. The new identity is built carefully. Research is done. The destination country is chosen for specific reasons. Legal, financial, linguistic, climatic. Nothing is improvised. Nothing is left to chance. The second element is completeness. The unsuccessful vanisher cuts ties incompletely. He stops calling his family. But then one day, cannot resist sending an anonymous birthday card to his daughter. She doesn't know it's him. But the postmark is from a city and the handwriting is familiar, and slowly the picture assembles. The successful vanisher is absolute. He burns every bridge. He makes no contact. Not ever. Not once. This requires a form of psychological strength or sociopathy, depending on how you frame it, that most people do not possess. The third element is the new identity's depth. A fake name is not enough. You need a fake history, a fake social security number or equivalent in your new country, fake employment records, fake references, a fake past that can withstand casual scrutiny, and ideally some level of more serious scrutiny. This is harder now than it was 20 years ago, but it is not impossible. Corruption exists in document issuing bodies around the world. Dark web services exist that sell extraordinary forgeries. And in some countries, registering a new identity is astonishingly easy. The fourth element, and this is perhaps the most counterintuitive, is normalcy. The failed pseudocide tries to hide. He moves to remote locations. He avoids cities. He lives off the grid. And this, paradoxically, makes him more suspicious. A man living alone in a rural cabin with no verifiable history is unusual. A man who moved to a mid-sized city in South America, got a job, joined a gym, made local friends, learned the language fluently, and built a life that looks completely ordinary. He is invisible, not because he is hiding, because he looks like everyone else. The most successful disappearances look like ordinary lives lived by ordinary people in ordinary places. The most romantic fantasy of the fugitive, the remote cabin, the off-grid existence, the mountain hermit, is actually the worst possible strategy. Blend in, look normal, be boring. That is the real secret. Now here's a story that sounds so cinematic, so extravagant, so thoroughly over the top that if you put in a movie script, the producer would send it back and tell you to make it more believable. Marcus Schrenker was a financial advisor in Indiana. Handsome, charismatic, the kind of man who made clients feel that their money was safe in his hands. That particular combination of confidence and warmth that the very best con men deploy so effortlessly. He was not safe. Their money was not safe. Schrenker had been stealing from clients, misappropriating funds, running his financial advisory business as a vehicle for personal enrichment at the expense of the people who trusted him. Indiana regulators were investigating him. His marriage was collapsing. His financial world was unraveling. And Marcus Schrenker decided he needed an exit, not just any exit. On January 11th, 2009, Schrenker climbed into a single-engine Piper PA-46 aircraft and took off from Anderson, Indiana. He filed a flight plan to Destin, Florida. Somewhere over Alabama, Marcus Schrenker sent a distress call to air traffic control, claiming the aircraft's windshield had imploded and he was bleeding profusely. And then radio silence. The aircraft continued flying on autopilot, without its pilot, on a course that would eventually take it over the Gulf of Mexico. Because Marcus Schrenker had done something that no American financial fraudster had done before. He had parachuted out of the plane. He landed in Alabama, near a storage unit where he had prepositioned a motorcycle. He had planned this. He had prepared for this. He rode the motorcycle to a campsite in Florida, where he had set up a tent under a false name. Meanwhile, the unmanned aircraft continued on autopilot. It eventually lost altitude and crashed near Milton, Florida. The wreckage was found. No body was inside, which was confusing. But crash investigations take time. And Marcus Schrenker was counting on that time. What he had not counted on was how quickly his story would fall apart. First, the distress call. When authorities reviewed the recording, the claim of a smashed windshield and profuse bleeding was not convincing. The voice was calm. Too calm for a man supposedly bleeding in a damaged aircraft. Second, Physical evidence at the crash site told investigators that the aircraft had been on autopilot, not in the hands of the panicking pilot, trying to manage an emergency. Third, witnesses in Alabama reported seeing a parachutist land in a field. Not the thing you expect to see on a Sunday night in rural Alabama. Fourth, and most critically, the motorcycle. Schrenker had rented a storage unit near the likely parachute landing zone weeks before the incident. Inside, investigators found motorcycle equipment, camping supplies, maps. This was premeditated. This was a plan. Within days, law enforcement had found Marcus Schrenker at his campsite in Florida. He had attempted to kill himself. He survived. He was tried, convicted, sentenced to more than 10 years in prison, on top of state charges in Indiana related to the financial fraud. The plane, the parachute, the motorcycle, the prepositioned campsite. It was ambitious, cinematically spectacular, and spectacularly unsuccessful. Because here is what Marcus Schrenker had forgotten in the excitement of planning his own personal action movie escape. Drama draws attention. The more spectacular the fake death, the more investigators are deployed. The more resources are committed, the higher the profile. And high-profile cases do not get quietly closed. If you want to disappear, the last thing you want is for your disappearance to make the news. We have been talking about the men who vanish. We have been following their plans, their escapes, their capture or non-capture. We have been, in a sense, inside their heads. Now I want to step outside that perspective entirely. Because for every man who faked his death, there is a woman, almost always a woman, though not always, who was left behind. And her story is not about escape. It is about the particular, devastating experience of grieving someone who is not dead. And Darwin knew she was complicit. Her case is complicated, but in a different way from the wives who did not know. The wives who did not know. The women who received the phone calls, who identified the clothing, who stood at the graveside, who cried themselves to sleep, who explained to children that daddy was not coming home, who rebuilt their lives slowly and painfully over years, and who then discovered, sometimes a decade later, sometimes through a chance encounter or a photograph or an anonymous tip, that the man they buried was not dead, that he had chosen to let them grieve, had decided, in cold calculation, that his need to escape was worth their years of pain. There are documented cases where wives grieved for years, remarried, built new lives, and then discovered that their first husband was alive. Legally, this creates extraordinary complications. The second marriage may be technically bigamous. The insurance money that was paid may need to be returned. The life insurance settlement that the widow used to pay off the mortgage, to put the children through college, to survive, that money becomes a legal nightmare. But the legal complications are nothing compared to the psychological ones. How do you process grief that was based on a lie? What do you do with all the mourning you did, the real, genuine, devastating mourning, when you discover it was unnecessary? Not unnecessary because he is okay and alive somewhere, but unnecessary in the most enraging possible sense, because he chose to put you through it. One woman, a British widow whose husband disappeared in a boating accident and was later discovered alive in Spain, said in an interview something that has stayed with people who heard it. She said, "When he died, I lost my husband. When I found out he was alive, I lost the years I spent mourning him too. He stole my grief, and I don't know which loss is worse." That sentence, "He stole my grief." There is no better description of what pseudocide does to people left behind. It is not just fraud. It is not just theft. It is a theft of the most intimate human experience, the experience of loss, turned into a lie. And the children, always the children. Children who grew up without fathers, who visited graves, who drew pictures in school of what heaven might look like and hoped their father was there, who shaped their entire understanding of death and loss and impermanence around a man who was, at that very moment, drinking a beer on a beach in Portugal. The children who eventually found out, the ones who have spoken publicly, describe a kind of double devastation. First, the loss of the father, then the loss of the idea of the father, the discovery that the man they remembered and missed and loved had looked at their future grief and decided it was worth it. Some never reconcile. Some refuse all contact when the father eventually resurfaces. Some spend years in therapy trying to untangle the knot of emotions that has no clean resolution. Because there is no clean resolution. There is no apology sufficient for years of manufactured grief. There is no explanation that makes it okay. There is only, as one adult child put it with devastating simplicity, the fact that I will spend the rest of my life not knowing if I can trust anything. Some cases of fake death are elaborate, some are desperate, and some are so incompetently executed that they collapse almost immediately before the body is even cold, so to speak. Raymond Roth was a 50-year-old pool company owner from New York. In July 2012, his son Jonathan reported that his father had been swimming at Jones Beach in New York and had disappeared in the waves. Coast Guard searched. Authorities searched. No body was found. Within days, investigators were suspicious. First, cell phone records showed that Raymond Roth had been making calls and sending texts after time he was supposedly swept away and drowned. Second, the texts were extraordinary in their specificity. Raymond Roth had been texting his son Jonathan, the same son who reported him missing, with instructions. He had told Jonathan to sell his car. He told Jonathan to contact his life insurance company. Third, investigators found emails in which Raymond Roth had researched, prior to his disappearance, the best places in the United States for a person to start a new life, the states with the weakest cross-referencing of identity documents, and the safest ways to access money after faking one's death. Fourth, and most definitively, Raymond Roth was found, not at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, in a hotel in Florida, planning to travel to South Carolina, with a one-way ticket to London subsequently booked. He had not even made it out of the country. He was arrested. His son Jonathan was arrested separately for his role in the scheme. At Raymond Roth's trial, the incompetence of plan was almost staggering. He had left a digital trail so wide and so clearly marked that it read less like a criminal conspiracy and more like a man who had watched too many true crime documentaries and believed he was smarter than he was. He had texted his escape instructions to the very person who was publicly reporting him missing. He had Googled how to start a new life in the weeks before his disappearance on devices that were subsequently examined by investigators. He had booked flights under his own name. Raymond Roth was sentenced to 2 1/3 to 7 years in prison. His son received a lesser sentence. The Roth case is, in a way, instructive precisely because of its failure. It illustrates something important about the psychology of men who plan to fake their deaths. Many of them genuinely overestimate their own intelligence and underestimate the sophistication of modern law enforcement. The digital age has made disappearing exponentially harder. Every search query is logged. Every financial transaction is recorded. Every cell phone pings towers that record its location. Every email lives on servers indefinitely. Every purchase leaves a data trail. The men who successfully fake their deaths in the modern era are not the men who Google how to fake your own death. They are the men who have spent years preparing, who understand operational security, who have moved money through layers of shell companies and offshore accounts long before any suspicion falls on them, and who have established entirely convincing new identities with the kind of patience and thoroughness that is almost incomprehensible to most people. The Raymond Roth of the world are not those men, and they pay for that gap. Let us talk about geography, because where you run is almost as important as how you run. For a pseudocide to work in the long term, you need to be somewhere that the long arm of your home country's law cannot reach you. And in the modern era of international policing cooperation, Interpol red notices, and bilateral extradition treaties, the list of genuinely safe havens is shorter than it used to be. The classic destinations have changed over the decades. In the 1970s and 1980s, certain South American countries, particularly Brazil and Argentina, were popular destinations for fugitives. The reason was partly historical. Both countries had large communities of European immigrants, making it easier for a European or American man to blend in. Both had traditions of privacy and limited cooperation with foreign law enforcement, and both were far enough from the United States and Europe that the practical difficulty of tracking and extraditing a fugitive was substantial. Some of these countries have changed their policies significantly. Brazil, for instance, now extradites in many cases. Argentina has modernized its law enforcement cooperation. The new safe havens are different. Some are in Southeast Asia. Countries where a Western man with money is not particularly unusual, where English is widely spoken or easily managed, where the lifestyle is pleasant and inexpensive, and where the relationship between local law enforcement and international agencies like the FBI or Interpol is, shall we say, not always smooth. Some are in Eastern Europe, countries where the post-Soviet legal infrastructure has not yet fully adapted to requirements of international policing cooperation, where corruption can be a practical shield, and where a foreign businessman with cash is welcomed rather than scrutinized. Some are in the Caribbean, small island nations with minimal law enforcement capacity, strong banking privacy traditions, and an economy built in part on the quiet management of money that does not want to be seen. Some, and this is the most audacious, are hiding in plain sight, in large cities in the fugitive's own country, or a neighboring one, under a new identity so well constructed that there is no reason for anyone to look twice. A man who successfully fakes his death and rebuilds as a new person in a large American city is, counterintuitively, harder to find than a man who flees to a small island nation and spends his days trying not to attract attention, because in the large city, there is no reason for anyone to be looking. In the island nation, an unexplained foreigner with unexplained money is always slightly conspicuous. The optimal destination depends on the specific circumstances. How much money do you have? What language do you speak? What skills do you have that are transferable to a new context? How long do you plan to maintain the fiction? Do you intend to eventually surface, or is this a lifetime commitment? These are the calculations that the most successful vanishers make carefully over years before the first move. And these are the calculations that the failed ones make hastily, in panic, in the days or hours before the net closes around them. There's a war happening. On one side, the people who want to disappear. On the other side, the technology that makes disappearing nearly impossible. And for the past 20 years, the technology has been winning. Facial recognition. This is perhaps the single most significant development in the history of investigating pseudocide. A man can change his name, dye his hair, grow a beard, lose or gain weight. He cannot change the fundamental geometry of his face, the distance between his eyes, the structure of his cheekbones, the shape of his ears. Modern facial recognition algorithms can identify individuals across significant changes in appearance, across years of aging, across dramatically different grooming choices. And facial recognition is now everywhere. Airports, train stations, border crossings, increasingly, shopping centers in streets and countries that deploy mass surveillance systems. The days when a fugitive could travel through an international airport with confidence that his new passport would be sufficient protection are largely over. Social media footprints. The man who has successfully disappeared still has people who remember him. His old friends are on social media. His family is on social media. And occasionally, more often than investigators might expect, the vanisher himself cannot fully resist the pull of the connected world. A fake account, a look at his daughter's Instagram, a comment left anonymously that contains a phrase, an in-joke, a reference that only he would make. These cracks in the discipline of disappearance are small, but they are visible to anyone looking carefully. Financial surveillance. The movement of money across borders is now tracked with thoroughness that would have been unimaginable 30 years ago. FATF, the Financial Action Task Force, the correspondent banking system, know your customer regulations, beneficial ownership registries. All of these are systems designed specifically to make it difficult to move money without creating a traceable record. A man who wants to move stolen millions from an American bank account to a Panamanian account without leaving a trail faces extraordinary technical challenges. It can be done. Cryptocurrency has opened new possibilities that regulators are still struggling to close, but it requires genuine technical sophistication and planning. Cell phone location data. This is what caught Raymond Roth, and it catches others constantly. Our phones are, in a very real sense, tracking devices that we carry voluntarily. Every ping to a cell tower is logged. Every connection to a Wi-Fi network is recorded by the router. Modern investigations can place a person at a specific location at a specific time with a precision that physical surveillance never achieved. A truly committed pseudocide in the modern era goes dark completely. No cell phone, not even a burner. Because burner phones are themselves now tracked, their patterns of use creating fingerprints. No use of the internet from any traceable device. No financial transactions in any currency that creates a record. This level of technological discipline is genuinely difficult to maintain. It requires either extraordinary expertise or extraordinary self-denial, and it requires maintaining that discipline forever, because the moment you slip, the digital trail resumes and investigators can pick it back up. So far we have been talking mostly about individuals. Men with debts, men with fraud charges, men trying to escape marriages or mortgages or prison sentences. But there is a darker level to this story. What happens when faking one's death is not a personal crisis management strategy, but a professional tool? What happens when the people facilitating these disappearances are not desperate husbands, but organized networks with expertise, connections, and the ability to produce documents, bribe officials, and manage identities with the professionalism of a dark version of a relocation service? These networks exist. They are not publicly advertised. They do not have websites, or at least not visible ones. They operate in dark corners of criminal ecosystems, connecting people with specific expertise. Document forgers, corrupt officials and identity-issuing agencies, real estate professionals in countries with weak ownership transparency, bankers in jurisdictions with strong secrecy laws. Their clients are not ordinary debtors. Their clients are the people with the highest stakes and the highest resources. Major financial fraudsters, organized crime figures who need to disappear after prosecution, terrorists who need to cease existing in one identity and reappear in another, very wealthy individuals who have reason to believe they are about to become subjects of major criminal investigations. The fees for these services are substantial. A full-service disappearance, new identity documents from a country with genuinely robust documentation, established financial accounts, property in the new location, backstopped history that could withstand serious scrutiny, can cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. But for a man who has stolen $50 million and is facing a federal indictment, that is a reasonable investment. These cases are the hardest for law enforcement to crack, not because the individuals are necessarily smarter than other fugitives, but because the infrastructure supporting them is deeper, the documentation is more convincing, and the networks protecting them have both the incentive and the capability to detect and neutralize investigative interest. Some of these cases have been cracked through informants, through lucky breaks, through the kind of sustained investigative patience that produces results over years rather than weeks. But many have not. Somewhere in the world, there are men living under names that are not their own, in countries that are not their origin, with histories that were manufactured rather than lived, financed by money stolen from people who never got it back, protected by systems built specifically to ensure they are never found. This is the dark truth that sits underneath the more colorful, more manageable stories like John Darwin and Samuel Israel. The ones we catch are not the best ones. Let us get inside the head, not of the man who is planning to disappear, not of the investigator hunting him, but of the man who has successfully disappeared and is now living his new life. What does that feel like? The early days are described by those who have eventually resurfaced or been caught as a combination of exhilaration and terror. The exhilaration of escape, the sense of having pulled off something enormous, of having outrun the thing that was closing in on you, the feeling of freedom that comes with shedding a life that had become unbearable, and the terror, the constant background terror that never fully goes away, the terror that the man at the next table has recognized you, that the person who smiled at you in the supermarket is a federal agent, that the slight delay when you showed your passport at the border was not just bureaucracy, but was something else. Paranoia becomes a permanent condition, not a diagnosable disorder, in most cases, not voices or delusions, but a constant vigilance that never fully relaxes, because it can never fully relax. One slip is enough. One person who recognizes a gesture, a phrase, a way of laughing. One database that connects a face to a name. The psychology of false identity is also, inevitably, the psychology of grief, because you have lost everything. Not in the way your family believes you have lost everything. You have not died, but you have lost everyone and everything that constituted your world. You have lost the ability to be seen, to be known, to be loved for who you actually are. Every new friendship you make, every new relationship you build, every person who comes to care for you, they care for the fiction, They care for the name that is not your name, the history that is not your history, the person you have constructed rather than the person you actually are. This is an extraordinary kind of loneliness. Some vanishers resolve it by eventually finding someone, a partner, a friend to whom they confess. Partly, not everything, but something, a hint of the truth. And this partial confession, which feels like relief, is also a catastrophic operational mistake, because now there is someone who knows. And people who know are people who can tell. And people who tell are what ends most successful suicides. Not technology, not investigators, not bad luck, a conversation, a confession, a moment of human vulnerability that the vanisher could not prevent because he was, underneath everything, still human. Let's talk about the money, specifically about who pays when someone fakes their death. The answer, most often, is an insurance company. And I know what you are thinking. Insurance companies are not sympathetic victims. They are enormous, profitable corporations that routinely dispute legitimate claims and make life difficult for genuine policyholders. That may be true, but in the context of pseudocide, the insurance industry deserves more attention than it usually gets. Because insurance fraud of this kind is not a victimless crime, even when the victim is a large corporation. Life insurance fraud costs the American insurance industry alone an estimated $2 billion every year. A significant portion of that is pseudocide-related, and the cost of that fraud is ultimately distributed across the entire pool of policyholders, meaning that every legitimate customer pays slightly higher premiums because a certain number of fraudsters are successfully stealing from the system. Insurance companies employ their own investigators. Some are former law enforcement. Some are former military intelligence. They are good at their jobs, and they are specifically trained to be skeptical of deaths that do not produce bodies. The rule of thumb in the insurance investigation world is simple: no body, close scrutiny, not necessarily denial. Life insurance can and does pay out without bodies, in cases of drowning, aviation accidents, and other circumstances where body recovery is genuinely impossible or impractical. But those cases are examined with exceptional care. What investigators look for: financial stress in the period before the death, recent life insurance purchases or increases in coverage, the classic last-minute policy that someone takes out 6 months before their convenient demise, inconsistencies in the witness accounts, cell phone records inconsistent with the claimed death scene, social media activity after the claimed death date. The insurance companies have gotten better at this. Much better. The Darwin case was not caught by insurance investigators. It was caught by a newspaper finding a photograph. But the methodology that investigators now use is substantially more sophisticated than it was in 2002 when Darwin vanished. Some companies now use artificial intelligence to cross-reference death claims with social media footprints, international travel databases, and financial records. The systems are not perfect. False positives cause genuine grief to real bereaved families whose claims are delayed or questioned, but they are increasingly effective. The arms race between fraudsters and investigators is, in the insurance world, moving steadily in favor of the investigators. I want to tell you about a case that has never been resolved. A case that sits in the files of investigators not as a closed matter, but as an open wound. I will not use the real name, because using the real name will be misleading in a case where the real name may itself be a fiction. I will call him Michael, which may or may not be anything like his actual name. Michael was an executive at a mid-sized financial services company in the early 2000s. He had access to significant client funds. He had, over several years, been misappropriating those funds with extraordinary care. Not in large, detectable amounts, but in small, regular transfers that were designed to look like routine administrative charges. By the time regulators began noticing irregularities, Michael had moved approximately $11 million into accounts in 3 different countries. Then, 3 weeks before the formal investigation was expected to begin, Michael was reported missing. He had gone sailing, alone, on a moderately rough day in coastal waters. His boat was found the following morning, drifting and unmanned, in waters known for strong currents. His body was never found. The investigation into financial irregularities continued, but without Michael as a target, it lost its momentum. Some of the money was recovered. Most was not. 18 months later, investigators received an anonymous tip. A man matching Michael's description had been seen in Southeast Asia, working as a private financial consultant, living modestly, keeping a low profile. Investigators traveled to investigate. They could not find him. A second tip came from a different country. This time, investigators arrived within 48 hours. The address was real. The apartment had been recently vacated. A neighbor said the man had moved suddenly, very suddenly. He had been tipped off. How? By whom? Those questions were never answered. Michael, or whatever his name is now, has not surfaced. There have been occasional sightings, occasional tips, none that have led anywhere conclusive. The $11 million is, for practical purposes, gone. Investigators who work the case describe it with particular kind of frustration, not anger. They are professionals. They have seen worse. But a genuine intellectual irritation, because Michael, whoever he is, appears to have done everything right. The planning was thorough. The financial preparation was years in the making. The death scene was convincing without being theatrical. The new identity was built carefully. And when investigators came close, he moved. He is out there, somewhere, living a life built on stolen money and manufactured identity and the grief of people who once trusted him. And he has gotten away with it. So far. Because the other thing investigators say, uniformly about cases like this is, so far is not the same as forever. The investigation of pseudocide in the modern era is a discipline that barely existed 20 years ago. Today it is a sophisticated, multi-agency, technologically intensive field with its own methodologies, its own specialist investigators, and its own increasingly effective track record. Let me walk you through what actually happens when investigators suspect a death is fake. The first step is almost always financial. Following the money is not just a cliche. It is the single most reliable thread to pull. Where's the money? When was it moved? To what accounts? Through what structures? The suspicious activity reports filed by banks, the currency transaction reports, the beneficial ownership registries that more and more countries are creating. All of these create a picture of financial activity that cannot easily be hidden if investigators know where to look. The second step is digital forensics. Every device the subject used is now a potential treasure trove. Search history. What were they looking for in the months before the disappearance? Communication records. Who were they talking to? About what? With what frequency? Email archives. What was planned? What was arranged? With whom? Financial account access logs. Were accounts accessed after the death date? From what location? The third step is geospatial analysis. Cell phone tower records, credit card transaction locations, toll records from highways, surveillance camera footage from transport hubs. All of these can reconstruct a timeline of movement with remarkable precision. A man who claims to have drowned in the ocean on Tuesday night, but whose cell phone pinged a tower in Ohio on Wednesday morning, presents a problem for the drowning narrative. The fourth step is international coordination. This is where things get complicated. Information sharing between law enforcement agencies in different countries is better than it has ever been, but it is still imperfect, still subject to political dynamics, still limited by what different countries are willing to share and under what circumstances. Interpol red notices, the closest thing to international arrest warrants that exists, are powerful tools, but they require a member country to issue them. They require the subject to cross a border in a country that takes them seriously, and they are not invisible. Sophisticated subjects know they exist and manage their movement to avoid the situations in which they are most effective. The fifth step, and this is perhaps the most important one in practice, is human intelligence. Someone always knows. Maybe not who the subject really is, but someone knows that the man living in an apartment 4B arrived suddenly, paid cash for several months in advance, has no local ties, speaks the language with noticeable accent, and never talks about his family. Someone knows that the man doesn't exist on social media. Someone finds it slightly odd. Those someones, approached correctly and at the right time, are the cracks through which cases crack open. Some of them eventually come back. Not all, not most, but some. They come back for different reasons. Some come back because the loneliness becomes unbearable. Years of living as a ghost. Years of being known only as a fiction, of having no one in the world who knows your real name, produces a form of psychological suffering that proves, for some people, worse than whatever they were running from. Some come back because they get sick. The prospect of dying alone in a foreign country under a name that is not yours, die without the people who actually love you knowing you existed, changes the calculation. Some come back because they hear something from home. A parent is dying. A child is in trouble. Something pulls them back with a force that all the planning and all the discipline cannot fully resist. Some come back because they never fully believed they could get away with it. They needed to believe it for the escape. They sustained it for longer than they expected, but at some level they always knew it would end. And some come back because they're caught, not by investigators, not by technology, but by something more mundane, a face in a crowd that looks familiar, an old friend who moved to the same city. A chance encounter at an airport. The return, when it happens, is rarely clean. There is almost always legal consequence. Even in jurisdictions where faking your death is not technically a crime, and in many places it is not, in and of itself, there are almost always related crimes. Insurance fraud, identity fraud, financial crimes, tax evasion. And there is the human consequence. The conversations with family that cannot be scripted. The look on a child's face when a father who is supposed to be dead is suddenly not dead. The particular silence of a spouse who has to reorganize their entire understanding of the last decade. Some families do reconcile. In a small number of cases, where no major financial fraud was involved, where the circumstances were genuinely sympathetic, where enough time has passed and enough explanation has been given, relationships are rebuilt. But these are the exceptions. More often, the return produces something that cannot be categorized as reconciliation or as permanent estrangement, a middle state, a relationship that is functional but never again fully trusting, a permanent awareness on both sides that the person across the table has demonstrated, with proof that they are capable of a level of deception that most people do not think humans are capable of. That knowledge does not go away. It cannot be unlearned. It sits between people like a third presence at every subsequent meal, every subsequent conversation, every subsequent embrace. Now I want to ask the question that underlies all of these stories. The question that none of the legal analysis or investigative methodology or financial forensics ever quite addresses. Can a person truly become someone else? Not legally, not in terms of documents and identity, but truly, in the sense that matters, psychologically, spiritually, humanly. Can a person leave behind who they are and become someone new? The vanishers seem to believe they can. The act of pseudocide is premised on this belief, that identity is a legal and social construct, that a name is just a label, that the self is portable and transferable, that you can pick it up and move it to a new container. There is a philosophical tradition that supports this view, the idea that the self is not fixed, that we are, as Heraclitus suggested, constantly changing. You cannot step in the same river twice, and you are not the same person who stepped into it the first time. But the experiences of the people who actually try to live this philosophy, the ones who fake their deaths and build new lives, suggest something more complicated. The past does not stay behind. It comes with you. The way you laugh, the words you reach for under stress, the food that comforts you, the music that reaches you, the reflexive responses to certain situations, the things that make you angry and the things that make you glad, the fundamental shape of your personality. These things are not attached to your name. They travel with you under whatever name you choose. And the things you did, the people you hurt, the relationships you destroyed, the grief you manufactured, these things travel with you too, not as evidence that can be used against you, but as something more persistent and more inescapable, as guilt, or if not guilt, then as a permanent awareness of what you chose. The most honest accounts from people who lived this life, who built new identities and lived in them for years, describe not a sense of liberation, but a sense of constantly carrying something heavy, the weight of the truth, the weight of who they actually are, living underneath the fiction they perform for the world. Some find ways to make peace with this weight, to build lives that have genuine meaning within the fiction, to love people with a love that is real, even if the name it travels under is not. But the self does not disappear. It cannot be faked. It is the one thing about a person that resists every attempt at reinvention, And perhaps that is why the cases that seem most settled, the man living quietly in South America, the woman who changed her name and her country and never looked back, still carry this quality of incompleteness, of a life that is somehow not fully inhabited, of a person who is present but also somehow elsewhere. You can fake your death. You can build a new name. You can construct a new history. But you cannot construct a new self. The self that ran is the self that arrived, and it has to live for the rest of its days in the house it built for someone who does not exist. We are living through a technological revolution that is changing pseudocide in ways that are only beginning to be understood. On one hand, the technologies of surveillance, facial recognition, digital forensics, global financial monitoring have made disappearing harder than ever before. On the other hand, new technologies are creating new possibilities that earlier generations of would-be vanishers could not have imagined. Cryptocurrency, the ability to store and move value outside the traditional banking system, in transactions that are pseudonymous rather than fully anonymous, has created new options for the financial component of pseudocide. A man who moves a stolen millions into Bitcoin before disappearing faces a very different set of investigative challenges than a man who moves money through traditional bank transfers. The blockchain is public. Every transaction is visible, but the identities behind the wallet addresses are not, and connecting a wallet address to a real person requires a kind of forensic analysis that is expensive and time-consuming. This has not gone unnoticed by law enforcement. Blockchain analytics companies, firms that specialize in tracing cryptocurrency transactions, have become increasingly important partners for investigators. The number of cryptocurrency-related arrests connected to financial fraud has increased substantially in recent years, but remains a faster-moving arms race than most other financial investigation areas. Deepfakes, the ability to create convincing video and audio impersonations of real people using artificial intelligence, is a developing threat that has not yet been fully exploited in pseudocide cases, but the potential is obvious and alarming. A deepfake video of a person saying goodbye could, in principle, be created and distributed to establish a narrative of voluntary disappearance rather than foul play. A deepfake audio message could be used to deceive family members, buying the vanish your time. These capabilities exist. They are improving rapidly, and their application to identity fraud and disappearance is, to investigators, a source of significant concern. Biometric spoofing. As biometric identification, fingerprint scanning, iris recognition, facial recognition at borders becomes more prevalent, the technology to spoof these systems is developing alongside it. Silicone fingerprint overlays that fool scanners. Contact lenses that alter iris patterns. These are not science fiction. They are commercially available in varying degrees of sophistication. The arms race between the technology of disappearing and the technology of finding has never been more intense. And the outcome of that race, which side pulls ahead in the years to come, will determine whether pseudocide becomes more or less achievable for the people desperate or determined enough to attempt it. What remains constant through all the technological change is the human element. People talk. People make mistakes. People get lonely. People fall in love and trust the wrong person. People, under the accumulated weight of years of deception, crack. Technology can be defeated. Human nature cannot. We have come a long way. From John Darwin hiding behind a connecting door in Hartlepool, to Samuel Israel's dusty message on a car hood, to Marcus Schrenker parachuting out of a plane, to the anonymous Michael, $11 million in hand, still somewhere in the world, still not found. What do all these stories tell us? They tell us about desperation, about the specific human experience of watching the walls close in and reaching for any door. Even a door marked with skull and crossbones, even a door that leads to a life of permanent exile and permanent falsehood, rather than face what is coming. There is something almost comprehensible in that desperation, not forgivable, not excusable, but comprehensible, because most of us have had moments, not anywhere near this extreme, but moments when we wanted to disappear, when the accumulated weight of our mistakes and our failures and our fears felt like something we simply could not carry anymore, when starting over, cleanly, completely, somewhere no one knew us, felt like the only breath of clean air available. Most of us do not act on that impulse. Most of us find other ways. But the men and women who fake their deaths are people who reach that impulse and, for one reason or another, lack of options, lack of moral constraint, lack of imagination about any other solution, chose to follow it all the way. These stories also tell us about identity, about the strange, fragile, essential thing that we are underneath our names and our histories and our social roles. The self that cannot be faked. The truth that travels with us everywhere. The irreducible core of who we are that persists even when everything else has been changed. The vanishers discover, almost universally, that there is no escaping the self, that the person who ran is the person who arrived, and that building a new life on the foundation of a lie is building on sand. It can be done. It can be maintained for years, sometimes decades, but it is never solid. It is never truly home. And these stories tell us about consequences, about the people who are left behind, the wives who grieve, the children who grow up with a ghost in the house, the friends who blame themselves, the parents who never stop hoping. These are not abstractions. These are real human beings whose lives are shaped, permanently, painfully, by the choice of one person prioritize their own escape over everyone else's truth. The legal punishment, when it comes, is rarely proportionate to human damage. A few years in prison for a lifetime of manufactured grief, a fine, a restitution order, and a book deal does not compensate for the children who grew up believing their father was dead. There is no clean resolution to these stories. Not for the vanishers, not for the people they left behind, not for the investigators who catch some, but not all of them, not for the insurance companies, the creditors, the investors, the partners who were defrauded. What there is in all of these stories is truth, eventually, imperfectly, sometimes too late, sometimes only partially. But the truth comes. John Darwin walked into a police station. Samuel Israel's bridge note was seen through. Marcus Schrenker's prepositioned motorcycle was found. Raymond Roth texted his escape instructions to the wrong person. The ones who are still out there, the Michaels of the world, the cases that are open files in investigators' offices, they are not exempt from this gravity. The truth pulls. It pulls at the vanisher who cannot call his daughter on her birthday. It pulls at the man who watches his mother's obituary appear online and cannot attend the funeral. It pulls at the person who has spent 15 years performing an identity that is not theirs, speaking a name that does not belong to them, building relationships on foundations that are false. The truth pulls, and sooner or later, for most of them, for the brave ones, for the tired ones, for the ones who simply cannot carry the weight anymore, the truth arrives. There is no perfect escape. There is only the question of how long the running lasts, and what it costs in years, in relationships, in the slow erosion of a self that was trying to escape itself, to finally, inevitably stop.